Ideas, much like organisms, evolve. They are born, they compete, and they mutate. And if they prove themselves adaptable, they persist. Just as iron sharpens iron, thought refines thought. It's through this recursive process that humanity inches closer and closer to sets of ideas that work. Not necessarily ideas that are true or correct, but those that best serve the practical needs of our time. Now, I should clarify where I stand. I'm not a prescriptivist, so to speak. I don't believe in fixed moral or epistemic hierarchies. I'm a descriptivist, if you will. I observe rather than decree. I'm also nihilistic in the philosophical sense. I don't think that there are objective truths or moral certainties that underpin our world. And while I'm agnostic about the existence of a God, I live as though the question makes little difference. When it comes to science, however, I'm an empiricist in practice, but a skeptic by principle. We can never know with absolute certainty, but we can test and observe and tentatively accept what appears to work. Our knowledge, in other words, is provisional. It is forever open to revision. That's where this essay begins, in that space between uncertainty and discovery, where ideas evolve. Every idea exists in an ecosystem. Some thrive, others perish. And this is not because they're more true, but because they're more fit to the environment in which they find themselves. This is Darwinian selection applied to thought. Richard Dawkins once coined the term meme to describe how ideas replicate, mutate, and spread through populations. A meme's survival depends not on its factual accuracy, but on its transmissibility, its ability to latch on to human minds and persist across time. But there's another layer to this. The success of an idea often depends less on its content than on its compatibility with existing systems. A useful idea might fail if it arrives too early, or thrive if it fits neatly into the cognitive niches people have already built. For instance, consider the idea of strict monotheism in early Judaism. It arose in a region saturated with polytheistic traditions, yet it survived and eventually proliferated. Many scholars argue that its endurance was tied to historical pressures like repeated exile, political instability, and cultural vulnerability. In such an environment, a unifying, centralized deity created a stable collective identity that could outlast displacement. The idea caught on not simply because it was compelling in itself, but because it answered the socio-political anxieties of the time. Its transmissibility lay in its capacity to bind a fractured population together. Contrast this with the philosophy of Epicurean atomism in the ancient world. It proposed a universe that was governed by natural laws without divine intervention. This was a worldview astonishingly similar to the later scientific materialism, but it arose in a cultural milieu steeped in metaphysics, fate, and divine authority. It challenged entrenched religious structures and offered little institutional advantage. As a result, it never became a dominant worldview. In a different historical moment, say during the Enlightenment or even the Scientific Revolution, it might have flourished, but in its original context, the surrounding ecosystem simply could not sustain it. These examples show that ideas don't prevail when they're correct, they prevail when the environment renders them transmissible. This makes intellectual history less a tale of linear progress and more a chaotic interplay between adaptation and contingency. Ideas evolve not toward truth, but toward viability. The trajectory of ideas is never purely rational. It is contingent. History is littered with examples of how random, unpredictable events have redirected the flow of thought entirely. Take the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. Within its walls were the works of early astronomers such as Aristarchus of Samos, who had already proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system centuries before Copernicus, and philosophers who speculated on atomism, evolution, and the nature of consciousness. These manuscripts represented entire intellectual trajectories that were abruptly cut short. Had they survived, it's conceivable that what we call the scientific revolution might have emerged a millennium earlier, reshaping religion and politics, and ethics beyond recognition. The Enlightenment could have come and gone before the fall of Rome. Likewise, if Darwin hadn't boarded the Beagle, the theory of evolution might have languished in obscurity for decades, awaiting another mind with his particular blend of curiosity and patience, and even his obsession. The timing mattered. The voyage provided him not only the evidence, but the context that made his insight possible. These chance occurrences are not minor details. They are the tectonic shifts of intellectual history. They remind us that our current set of accepted truths is just one branch on a vast, tangled tree of possibilities. Another roll of the cosmic dice, and the ideas we call obvious might never have existed at all. Now, Logic and mathematics would not themselves change under a different historical path. The principles of inference or the nature of number are not contingent in the same way, but the route by which we arrived at them and the cultural weight that they carry would have been different. What we consider self-evident might have taken radically different forms of justification, emphasis, or even expression. It's often said that iron sharpens iron, and I find that metaphor remarkably apt for the evolution of thought. Ideas refine themselves through conflict. Without opposition, there is no friction, and without friction, no refinement. This is the underlying logic of Hegel's dialectic, the process by which a thesis encounters its antithesis, and from their collision emerges a synthesis. A straightforward example, even one that Hegel himself might have appreciated, can be seen in the political development of the modern state. The absolute monarchies of early modern Europe, serving as the thesis, provoked the radical republicanism of the Enlightenment, the antithesis, and their conflict produced the constitutional democracy, the synthesis, which is a system that preserves order and continuity while institutionalizing dissent. This synthesis, of course, then becomes a new thesis destined to encounter opposition, its own antithesis in turn. The dialectic is endless, it is recursive, and it is generative. However, I don't think that this process leads towards some absolute or teleological truth. A teleological view of history presumes that events unfold according to some cosmic design, or that our intellectual evolution is steering towards a predetermined goal, like a man assembling a jigsaw puzzle whose final image is already fixed. But history resists such closure. Paradigm shifts, like the move from Newtonian mechanics to Einstein's relativity, or from geocentrism to heliocentrism. Paradigm shifts don't merely add new pieces to the puzzle. They replace the puzzle altogether. The framework changes, the old categories dissolve, and the image is rendered completely new. So, rather than inching closer to some transcendent endpoint, our understanding keeps reorganizing itself around what happens to work at any given time. The dialectic is not teleological. It is adaptive. In politics, this dynamic plays out in a particularly vivid way. Conservative thought serves as a stabilizing function. It preserves what has survived the test of time. It insists that traditions and institutions exist for a reason. They outcompeted alternatives in the past, and this implies that they have some functional advantage, even if we can no longer see it clearly. Progressivism, on the other hand, introduces variation. It probes the unknown, it questions the inherited, and it demands the revision of what's been taken for granted. On its own, progressivism risks chaos. Unrestrained change can be as destructive as stagnation, but together, when conservatism and progressivism exist in dynamic tension, they form an adaptive system. Stability meets experimentation. This mirrors the logic of biological evolution. Core genes governing essential functions must remain stable, while peripheral genes mutate, introducing variability that may or may not prove useful. Too much mutation, and the organism collapses. Too little, and it cannot adapt. The same applies to societies and their ideas. Balance is survival. This entire framework of intellectual evolution, dialectical refinement, and adaptive selection rests on one uncomfortable foundation, that there is no objective truth toward which we are necessarily progressing. There are only provisional truths, pragmatic constructs that happen to work for now. If we strip away the moral and metaphysical ambitions, what remains is a process of approximation. Human thought is asymptotic. It forever approaches coherence or functionality without ever actually reaching it. We are not uncovering eternal truths, but producing temporary solutions. Every philosophy is a scaffolding, a structure that helps us reach higher, only to be dismantled when it becomes obsolete. To live intellectually, then, is to accept impermanence, to understand that what we call wisdom is a fleeting adaptation to the present, and yet that impermanence is not meaningless. It precisely is what allows ideas to evolve. So perhaps the goal isn't to find the truth, but to cultivate the mechanisms that allow us to keep searching. Conflict, variation, adaptation. These are the engines of intellectual evolution. Ideas, just like organisms, thrive not in isolation, but in ecosystems dense with competition and contradiction. Our task is not to freeze them in place, but to keep them alive, exposed to the elements, and capable of change. If there is any wisdom in this, it is that we must learn to live without final answers, because it's in the absence of certainty that genuine discovery becomes possible.